Good morning, everyone. My name is Rick Cook. I'm the co-chair of the Global Initiatives Committee, along with Jocelyn Frederick, who sits as vice president of LA Land Economics Foundation, or LEF. LEF has funded academic research both in the US and abroad for many, many years and on numerous topics. And recently, for example, on the role of bots in influencing planning decisions, on planting resiliency for urban trees, housing well-being for disaster victims in Japan and India, 140 years of Manhattan housing permits, and the one also on upzoning experience, is it creating affordable housing. And today we're very pleased to hear straight from the researchers on their findings of a comparison of the impacts of alternative walkability measures on housing values. This study was led by Louis Merlin, associate professor in the Department of Regional Planning at Florida Atlantic University, and Steve Bourassa, chair of the Runstad Department of Real Estate at the University of Washington, together with their colleagues Martin Hosley and John Wren. Dr. Bourassa, as well as being chair of the department, is an endowed professor at the University of Washington for a little over a year now. He was previously chair of the Department of Urban and Regional Planning at Florida Atlantic University. In his academic career before that spanned the University of Louisville, University of Auckland, University of Sydney, Australian National University, and the University of Memphis. Steve holds a Ph.D. from the University of Pennsylvania. He's been an author of over 60 refereed journal articles, the editor or author of 3 books, and a contributor to book chapters, encyclopedia articles, working papers, and technical reports. And his current research interests include revisiting metropolitan house price income relationships, hedonic models and market segmentation, sea level rise in property values, walkability, and housing prices. Please welcome our distinguished speaker, Dr. Steve Bourassa, as he leads us through key findings on his team's research into a comparison of the impacts of alternative walkability measures on house values. For your interest, we will have some time at the end of Steve's presentation for a question and answer session. Please enter your questions in the chat box. We'll also ask all attendees today to complete a short survey of your experience in our webinar. Once again, welcome to all of our attendees, and Steve, welcome, and take it away, please.
Okay, thank you, Rick. And thank you to the Land Economics Foundation for funding this research. As Rick mentioned, this project was done in collaboration with Louis Merlin, Martin Hosley, and John Wren. The 4 of us previously worked on another Land Economics Foundation funded project that had to do with big data measures of accessibility and their usefulness in house price modeling. And this is a similar kind of a project here, but we're focusing now on walkability. And just a little bit about my colleagues. Louis is an expert on transportation accessibility measures. John Wren does a lot of work on transit-oriented development. Martin Hosley and I have done quite a bit of work, much of it together, over multiple decades on hedonic house price modeling. So we kind of complement each other's skills and interests. And I think the underlying motivation for this research was the increase in the amount of transit-oriented development that we were seeing, at least Louis, John, and I was at the same university as they are at now. At the time, noticed that there was an increase in transit-oriented development in the Miami metro area. And we were wondering about the relationship between that and prices. And that kind of simple motivation led to the paper that I'm going to be presenting now. So as our thinking evolved on this topic, we realized that there were lots of different options for measuring walkability. And the one that's used the most and that seems to be the most respected is walk score, which is a proprietary measure produced by a company, which is available for free for individual properties. But if you want to do research and get walk scores for multiple properties, you have to pay, and it's somewhat costly. Hence our application to the Land Economics Foundation for funding, because we needed some money to purchase the walk score data that we needed. So given that there's a variety of other alternative measures of walkability, we decided to see how well they correlated with walk score. And of those that were the most highly correlated, how they compare with walk score as a predictor of house values. And initially we were going to focus on the Miami area, but subsequently we decided to add a couple other locations, which I'll mention in a moment. So walk score, as many of you probably know, is measured on a scale of 0 to 100, 100 being the most walkable. It is calculated as a weighted average of accessibility from specific addresses to a variety of different types of destinations. Although exactly how walk scores are calculated is more or less a black box. For example, we don't know how distance is measured or what kind of radius from the property in question is used to define accessibility. So we don't really know that much about how it's produced. And as I mentioned, it's free for individual addresses, but the bulk data needed for research is kind of costly. So in looking at alternatives, we categorize them into 4 types: accessibility measures, street network measures, land use mix measures, and indices that combine different measures from the other categories. And then I'm going to discuss each of those now. So under accessibility, one commonly used measure is simply access to jobs. How many jobs are there within a certain distance from the property in question, or whatever the location is, however defined. Some researchers have also focused on the number and acreage of parks within a certain distance. And these measures are typically calculated for census blocks. Which means that for every property within a census block, you would have the same value for each of these measures. And they're based on data within a certain radius of the census block in question. And we explored some of the typical radii that are used in these studies: 400, 800, and 1600 meters. And these roughly relate to maybe a 5, 10, 15-minute walk, something like that approximately. And we found that the measures based on not just the accessibility measures, but the other types of measures we looked at based on a 400-meter radius were most closely correlated with walk score, more closely correlated than the 800 or 1600-meter measures. So in the analysis that we did here, we just used data that was calculated for a 400-meter radius. And I should add that walk score is a type of accessibility measure, but it varies with individual addresses. It's not just calculated for census blocks the way these other measures typically are. The second category is street network measures, which, as you might guess, relate to the kind of physical structure of the streets in a particular area. So these are also calculated for census blocks based on data from the area within a certain radius of the block in question, 400 meters in our case. So these could be, or measures that have been used in the past include the number of intersections, the number of 3+ way intersections, the connected node ratio, which is the ratio of 3+ way intersections to the total number of intersections, the total mileage of the streets in the area, the mean or median perimeter of the blocks in the area, and the mean or median area of the blocks. And this is blocks in the kind of normal sense, not census blocks, but the actual street blocks. The third category is land use mixes. And there are a whole variety of these. There's probably an infinite number of different things that one could come up with in this category. One of them is refers to the balance between jobs and workers in a given area. Others look at different measures of jobs, different types of jobs, or all jobs within a given area. So mix 3 is the mix of workers, that's all jobs in all industries, jobs in consumer services, and jobs in public services. We created this measure ourselves because we thought some of the other measures had too many categories. And the more categories you have, the more likely it is that you're not going to be able to actually measure this, because you're going to have missing data for one of the categories, or zeros for one of the categories. So the other categories involve mixes of different jobs in different industrial categories. So this EMP5, office, retail, industrial services, and entertainment. Ewing 5, developed by Hamidi and Ewing, retail, entertainment, health, education, and personal services. And there's another group of 5 that has been used, a group of 9. The group of 9 is really the most problematic. It's got too many categories. And so it often is impossible to calculate. These land use mix measures were also calculated for census blocks, meaning that every property within a census block gets the same value based on data within a 400-meter radius of that census block. And then finally, we have the indexes. And there's really one of these that's prominent, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency National Walkability Index, or EPA index for short. This is based on a combination of land use mix measures, street intersection density, and the proportion of commuters who walk to work. This is calculated by the EPA for census block groups. So every property within a block group has the same value for this particular measure. It is updated periodically. We used, for this analysis that I'm reporting here, the data, I believe, from 2012 or 2013. It's been updated just a couple of years ago. And before we finalize this project, we're going to shift to the updated version of this. So our aim was to study urban areas with different levels of walkability. As I mentioned, we started out with Miami, which we didn't really think was particularly walkable, although somewhat surprisingly, it ranks 12th in the US. It was ranked 12th in the US for walkability among large metro areas by foot traffic ahead in their most recent report. We, in this analysis, focus on the urbanized area of Miami-Dade County using data from 2017. After I moved to the University of Washington, we decided to add Seattle, which probably perceived by people to be more walkable than Miami. And indeed, the foot traffic ahead report ranks Seattle fourth in the country in terms of walkability. We're focusing, at least for the time being, on the city of Seattle using data from 2021. We realized that we had enough funds left over to add a third city. And after considering the options, we settled on Chicago. And we just recently received the walk scores for our Chicago data set. So we're going to be working on that soon and adding Chicago to the final published paper on this research project. One thing we may do is change the boundaries within each area, maybe even the time periods that we look at. One question that we bumped up against as we were working on the Miami and Seattle data is that it's not really clear how best to define the areas within which walkability is relevant. We started out looking at counties, Miami-Dade County and King County for Seattle, and realized that much of each of those counties is not walkable at all. In fact, much of eastern King County is very sparsely inhabited. It's mountainous, and there's just not very many people living there. So walkability is irrelevant. And even in the Miami area, as you go further west and get closer to the Everglades, and a significant part of the county is taken up by Everglades, but there's also a large rural agricultural area in Miami-Dade County where walkability is largely irrelevant. So we realized we needed to focus on smaller areas, but exactly how you define those smaller areas is not entirely clear. It's something we want to focus on a bit more as we further develop this analysis. So here's just a heat map showing walk score in the Seattle area. This is the map is roughly showing the boundaries of King County. As you can see, the area to the east doesn't even show any data. I mean, these are based on housing transactions. So in 2021, so you can see that there's not much going on in the eastern part of the county. Most of what's happening is in the western part where people live. And the city of Seattle is actually the red area, pretty much defined by this red area, which has fairly high walk scores. And you can see really concentrations of high walk scores in the downtown area and adjacent areas in central Seattle and in a few other suburban areas to the north. And then here we have the Miami heat map for walk score. You see the high walk scores in downtown Miami, some of the more densely developed areas to the west, which include Coral Gables, Kendall. And particularly if you're at all familiar with Miami, you've probably been to South Beach, in Miami Beach, which is shown as being highly walkable in this map. And then a couple of the other measures that we focus on, we thought would be a good idea to have a look at the maps. This is the Mix 3 land use mix measure that we developed. Basically, the colors show quintiles. The darker green is more walkable. And again, you see in Seattle, you see in the downtown area and some of the suburban areas to the east and north, but also in the Bellevue area, Redmond, where Microsoft is located. and a few other areas like Renton, we see high levels of walkability. The Miami pattern's a little bit different. We see sort of these concentrations of walkability in commercial areas along major transportation corridors, in addition to the downtown area, Miami Beach, Key Biscayne, so forth. And then the EPA index, we see fairly high. These are, again, are quintiles, the darker green being the more walkable areas. We see a very high concentration of dark colors in central and northern parts of Seattle. Miami is more spread out, not quite so concentrated. So the first thing we did was to, after we developed our list of a number of different measures that I discussed earlier, we produced those measures and we correlated them using our house addresses, the addresses for the house price transactions that we used for the analysis. We correlated the measures with walk score. And that was the first step. And then the second step was for the measures that were highly correlated, we compared their performance using hedonic house price models. In other words, models that explain house prices using the characteristics of those houses. So we sought to, in doing the correlation analysis, we sought to identify at least one measure from each of the accessibility, street network, and land use mix categories. However, it turned out that none of the network variables was highly correlated with walk score in Miami. So we didn't manage to identify one of those variables for the Miami analysis. Job access was highly correlated for Miami, but not Seattle. But it turned out to have the wrong sign in the hedonic model, so we abandoned that. The EPA index was highly correlated in both locations, so that one of the alternative measures that we decided to focus on. So for Miami, the final set of measures we used for comparison with walk score were the EPA index and mix 3. And mix 3, although it was the one that we created, we didn't choose it because it was the one we created. We chose it because it had the highest correlation of the land use mix variables with walk score. And for Seattle, same two measures plus street density. So for the hedonic analysis, we used the standard procedure of defining the sale price in logarithmic terms for the dependent variable. We estimated separate models for each city or urban area. So far we've done separate models for Miami and Seattle and for each walkability measure. And we had a variety of other independent variables in the model: living area, land area, age of structure. Condo, we were able to include that only for Miami. The Seattle data includes only single family houses. Distance to the CBD, distance to the ocean in Miami, presence of various types of views, such as of the Olympic Mountains or the Cascade Mountains or water, Puget Sound in Seattle. Waterfront location in Seattle, condition of the building, value of special features, and the quarter of sale within the year that we studied. For some of our estimations, we also included zip code dummies in the case of Miami, or census tract dummies in the case of Seattle, because we didn't have the zip code dummies readily at hand in Seattle. We also included the poverty rate calculated for census block groups as a separate variable and also interacted with the walkability measure. We did this because we had a theory that walkability might depend on poverty rate, so that the value of walkability, in other words, we thought probably varied depending on how well off the neighborhood was. We also standardized the walkability measures so that we could easily compare the results across the models, because the different measures have different scales. Walk score 0 to 100, EPA index is 0 to 20, mix 3 is 0 to 1. So they can't really compare the results unless you standardize the measures. So generally, the models performed as expected, with each of the walkability measures having a positive relationship with house prices. When we added the zip code or census tract dummies to the models, not surprisingly, the models explained a significantly greater percentage of the variation in house prices, because these dummies for small areas pick up a lot of things that are otherwise not measured in hedonic models. So they add a lot of explanatory power. But at the same time, they reduce in Miami or completely eliminate in Seattle the impacts of the walkability measures, kind of suggesting that if you're not really interested in walkability per se, you may not need to bother with including walkability in a hedonic model, because you're picking up all or most of the effect of walkability if you include dummy variables for small areas. We also found that poverty interacts with walkability in Miami, which incidentally has a much higher average poverty rate than Seattle. It does not interact with walkability in Seattle. We also found that of the walkability measures that we modeled, the overall performance of the models does not vary much, depending upon which measure you use. So they're more or less interchangeable. We did notice that the EPA index has a higher marginal effect, and I'll come back to that in a moment with some actual numbers, than walk score in both of the study areas. And because the EPA index is readily available to researchers, you can just download it from a website, it seems to be a particularly good substitute for walk score. So it's free, readily available. If you don't want to pay for walk score, use EPA index. Mix 3 performs about the same as walk score, but it's not readily available. We just created it. We've only created it so far for Miami and Seattle. We're calculating it now for Chicago, but it's, so it's available for those cities, but not generally. Street density had a larger effect than walk score in marginal effect than walk score in Seattle, but no effect in Miami. As I mentioned earlier, it had a low correlation with walk score in Miami, so it's not surprising that it didn't work. So we would think that this is not a good alternative to EPA index because it's not consistent. So this table shows the marginal effects of a 1 standard deviation change in the walkability measure on a median priced house in Miami. And at the time, in 2017, the median priced house was $315,000. I think now it's probably at least double that. Because the poverty rate interacts with walk score, we have to take the poverty rate into account when we calculate these estimates. These poverty rates represent the 25th, 50th, and 75th percentiles of the distribution of poverty rates across census block groups in our study area. So for the lower poverty rates, the effect of a 1 standard deviation change would be, well, in the case of walk score, an increase in or decrease in the value of the house of $12,000. EPA index, as I mentioned earlier, has a higher marginal effect. Mix 3 is more comparable to walk score in its effect. As the poverty rate increases, the marginal effect of a 1 standard deviation change on a median priced house goes down. This is what we were expecting. We were thinking that walkability in high poverty areas is probably not valued as much as in lower poverty areas. And just to help explain these numbers a little bit more, for Miami, the mean walk score is about 56 and the standard deviation is about 28. So we're talking about really large, when we talk about a 1 standard deviation change, we're talking about a really large change in walk score to get these impacts on prices. So the impacts you would have to say are kind of small, given the median price of $315,000, and the fact that you really have to have a big change in walk score to get these kinds of impacts. Effects are larger, not surprisingly in Seattle, where in 2021 the median priced house was at least in our sample, was $895,000. Poverty, as I said, doesn't interact with walkability in Seattle, so we don't take it into account here. But a 1 standard deviation change in each of these measures results in a change in house price of the magnitude shown. Walk score about $35,000, the EPA index 51, street density 56 or $7,000, mix 3 similar to walk score about $38,000. And for Seattle, the mean walk score is greater than in Miami, as you would expect, about 67. And the standard deviation is 19, so smaller standard deviation, which is perhaps not surprising based on the heat map that we looked at previously, which showed a pretty uniform high level of walkability within the Seattle city limits. So further study, as I mentioned, we're going to include data from Chicago. We're going to reconsider the geographic boundaries, try to figure out what is the appropriate boundary to use when doing analysis of walkability. Maybe change the time periods for Miami and or Seattle. As I mentioned, we're able to include condominiums in the Miami analysis, which is interesting. We weren't able to do that in Seattle due to limitations of the data, and the same applies to Chicago. So we need to figure out whether we want to keep the condos in the Miami analysis or maybe look at them separately from the single family houses. We also want to incorporate the recently updated version of the EPA index. And then finally, Martin and I have been working on the application of machine learning techniques or artificial intelligence techniques to analysis of house prices. And really, it seems like that the future is not using the kind of traditional ordinary least squares kinds of hedonic models that we have applied so far in this model. I think the future of house price modeling is going to involve machine learning techniques more and more. So we want to experiment with applying some of these techniques to the data to see if the results that we get support the results that we got using more conventional approaches. So we've been working on this project for some time, but we still have a fair amount of work to do before we, I think, are ready to finalize our report and submit a paper to a journal for possible publication. So that is the end of the presentation, and I definitely stuck within my 45-minute time limit. So we've got plenty of time for questions, I think, Rick.
Terrific. Thanks, Steve. Sheila, maybe you can put my face back on there if you want to. I'm not sure if I'm there. That's great. I appreciate that. And I have a couple of questions that I had that I thought you talked about the neighborhood fixed effects capture much of the effects of the walkability measures. And I wasn't quite clear on what you meant by neighborhood fixed effects in that when you in your sort
Uh-huh.
of one page.
Okay, so in the Miami case, for example, when we include these neighborhood fixed effects, what we're doing is we're including variables for each of the zip codes in the area. So we've got a 0, 1 dummy variable for each of the zip codes. And these types of variables pick up a lot of things that are going on at the neighborhood level that are not otherwise measured by the other variables in the model. So one of those things is walkability, which tends to be fairly, reasonably consistent within neighborhoods, it seems. So although walk score is provided for individual and calculated for individual properties, there's a lot of consistency within a neighborhood with respect to walk score. And there definitely is a lot of consistency in a neighborhood with respect to the other measures because they don't vary for census blocks or for census block groups. So you've already got relatively limited variation within a neighborhood for those other measures. So when you add those zip code variables to the model, they wind up they're not just picking up the effects of walkability, they're picking up lots of other stuff that we're not measuring too. So if you're not particularly interested in walkability when you're studying or modeling house prices, then you might not bother trying to measure it, just put in these fixed effects. But if you are interested in walkability, I think the conclusion of our paper is if you don't want to pay for walk score, use the EPA index.
Okay. Thanks, Steve. There's a question in the box, and I'm not clear if it's exactly been answered or not, and I just want to raise it. And that is you've talked about the relationship, particularly in Miami, to poverty rates. The question is with regard to just read it out here properly. It says, can these measures tell us much about equity of access? And have you explored this dimension? Is the poverty rates an attempt to get at that equity of access?
Not exactly. I mean, one thing we could do, which I don't think we have done, is to correlate the poverty rates with the walkability measures. That would be an interesting thing. Yeah. I mean, and I think that would get at that equity question, because you would be able to see how walkability relates to poverty. But I guess there is a kind of an equity question embedded in the results that we found for Miami, where you get a lower premium for walkability in higher poverty areas. I mean, we don't really know the reason for that, but we had some theories. You were thinking that, well, maybe it's less pleasant to walk in those areas, or more fear of crime. I don't know whether there's more crime or not, but let's say there's more fear of crime, or something else going on that might make people value walkability less in those kinds of locations. But it could also be that there are fewer places to walk to that you might want to walk to. Yeah.
Another question here in the chat is, would you anticipate changes in the models due to shifts in land use during and after the pandemic, such as hybrid work and a broad move to the suburbs?
Well, yeah, that's one reason why we were wondering whether the years we chose to study were the optimal ones. So we have Miami pre-pandemic. We have Seattle right in the middle of the pandemic, and I think we have Chicago. I forget what year we have for Chicago, but whatever we were able to get from the assessor's office there. And so we were not quite sure we were comparing apples and apples across the cities. But yeah, that's definitely a concern, that something that we're thinking about. But what we'll actually do about it, I'm not sure yet.
In the spirit of the LAI membership, you only get hard questions in the question and answer. We probably should have told you that ahead of time.
Oh, that's okay. No, these are good questions.
So I'm going to ask a preview question, because I'm a land use planner, and I know we have a wide range of people here who may not know what hedonic means in this context. So if you could explain hedonic, and then the question is really says models underlying hedonic property values often include locational variables. If so, isn't there the possibility of autocorrelation impacting your analysis?
Okay, so hedonic models basically attempt to explain house prices using the various characteristics of those. Well, it doesn't have to be houses, could be anything, could be cars, computers, whatever, could be office buildings. But in this case, we're looking at house prices or condo prices, and so we've got the price that a property transacted for on the left-hand side of an equation, and then we've got measures of all the various characteristics. How big is the house? How big is the lot? Various measures related to location, such as, for example, the distance to the central business district, characteristics of the neighborhood, for example, measures, if they're available, of the quality of the house, anything that seems relevant to house prices. Views, for example, we used in the Seattle case. So when you model like that, what you wind up getting is a series of estimates for each of the value of each of those characteristics. And in response to the question that we got from the listener, yes, it's often a problem to figure out what's causing what, because there can be a lot of correlation among the different measures. And for example, that's what's happening when we add the zip code measures or the census tract measures to the models. That's exactly what's happening. Those measures are correlated with the walkability measures. And as a result of that, in the case of Miami, they reduce the impact of reduce the apparent impact of the walkability measures. In the case of Seattle, it's even worse. They changed the sign of the estimates for the walkability measures from positive to negative, which often happens when you have correlation within a model like this. So one kind of measure dominates one or more other measures. So in this case, the census tract measures dominate the walkability measures. In other words, they explain much better actually what's going on than the walkability measures do. And I think that this is, I mean, it's even potentially an issue when we don't include the zip codes or the census tract. So walkability might be, well, an obvious thing that walkability might be related to is distance to the central business district. The census business district is pretty walkable. usually. So the closer you are to it, might be the more walkable an area might be. So that's definitely a problem that is very difficult to kind of tease out. But we're thinking that some of the machine learning techniques that I mentioned toward the end of the presentation that we are planning to apply to this might help us to tease out that more effectively, because they tend to be better at getting, or they can be better at getting at that kind of a problem than the conventional hedonic modeling approaches. So we are hoping to get some more insight on that as we move further into the analysis.
Related to that, I have to look at my own experience, I guess, in Canada and from Vancouver. And when we look at city planning in general, we're often looking at how close are you to a frequent transit route, something that's like a 10-minute frequency of transit. And that may be autocorrelated with walkability as well. But it's one of the major facters for.
I think it's even something that factors into the walk score calculation, I believe.
Okay, yeah, because that's certainly the area where our type of analysis is going, and certainly research that was we funded recently in Vancouver region. I have a comment, not a question, but it's from John DeVries, and he wanted to, who's president of the LEF, has been listening, and he wanted to say thank you, Steve, for adding new cities and new variables to your research, utilizing the original LEF grant, and looking forward to keeping us posted on Chicago and perhaps an update for keynotes on online magazine.
Yeah, John, I realize you're probably particularly interested in the Chicago results.
Yes. So I think that's all the questions we have, and I really wanted to thank you, Steve, for an excellent presentation and really understandable to a broad audience, which we always appreciate, even if I didn't know what hedonic quite meant.
I deliberately left out the tables of regression results that you sometimes see in these presentations. So
exactly, yeah, no, it was very nicely tuned to our audience, and we very much appreciate it. Look forward to seeing your published research on this. If you like these presentations of LEF funded research, I'm going to encourage you to support the LEF research by making a donation next time you attend, and tick that box when you register to support the LEF work. Global initiatives at LAI has been involved in a number of other presentations, and I want to just tell you a couple of them that are up on your screen now. On September 22nd at noon Central, Dr. Jania Howell from the University of Illinois, Chicago. She recently presented to a hearing in Washington, D.C. that was, and she'll be opening a planned series of 4 events that we've called Color of Law 2, Equitable Residential Appraisal, Recent Findings. And like Dr. Bourassa's team, Dr. Howell has looked at a massive data set, this time 47 million appraisals using the U.S. Uniform Appraisal Data Set from 2013 to 2022. And she and her colleague have concluded that neighborhood racial inequality has been growing significantly in the last decade, including through the pandemic. So we're looking forward to hearing from Dr. Howell on September 22nd. Related in that series is at 8 a.m. on Eastern Time, the New York chapter of LAI will be hosting a webinar featuring Michelle Bradley, who is speaking on the topic of changes in appraisal standards and qualifications as that criteria is being considered by the Appraisal Qualifications Board of the Appraisal Foundation. And that webinar from New York will also be open to all LAI members and be posted soon on an upcoming events e-blast. And finally, on October 26th at 11 Central Time, we'll feature a panel of speakers from both legal, insurance, and regulatory perspectives, speaking on home ownership in transition. That's a Canada-California comparison. And this panel will focus on the differences in construction defect and financial risk mitigation between these two jurisdictions to help explain why in the last decade, 38% of new housing units built in Canada have been ownership townhome or ownership apartment condo units, whereas only 3% have been in that characteristic in California over that last decade. So please watch your email inbox for upcoming events from LAI. And as we noted at the beginning, today's recording or webinar has been recorded. You'll receive a link to that, and look forward to you sharing that with with people that you think are interested in it. And finally, there is a survey that's in your chat box that we'd encourage you to answer before you leave the webinar. Thank you again. Thank you, Steve, for a great presentation. And I want to note one thing is that we're hoping to reestablish our chapter in Puget Sound. And I know Barton DeLacy was on the call here. He's been spearheading that. If any of you are in the Seattle area interested in speaking to us about reinvigorating that chapter, we're very active on that. And please send your interest to Sheila Hamilton at lai.org. Thank you kindly for everyone, and have a good day.